Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rosalie Gunawan. I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager at the Chinese Canadian Museum. For those of you who are attending your first webinar hosted by us, the Chinese Canadian Museum is located in Vancouver, Chinatown, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Many of you may be zooming in from places outside of Vancouver, including some of our panelists who I know are on Vancouver Island. So we just invite you all to reflect on the territories that you're on and the host nations and learn a bit more about that history. So Chinese settlers have had a long history of contact with First Nations ever since the first arrival of Chinese shipbuilders to Yuquot in 1788, and we're excited to explore some other stories of Chinese Indigenous connections through some of the featured articles in the magazine that sparked this panel today, and the featured articles in it. So to introduce this program, we are collaborating with the BC History magazine around their new issue, their winter 2024 edition around Chinatowns and belonging. So this is a edition that is focusing on Chinatowns all around BC, decentering Vancouver Chinatown and Victoria as the most well-known Chinatowns. And we have with us here today 5 of the authors of the featured articles in the BC History magazine. Somehow everyone is affiliated in some way with the Chinese Canadian Museum. We have staff members, we have a board member, we have our guest curator, museum assistants. Everyone here has played a really important role in the launch of the Chinese Canadian Museum. So we're excited to have all of their contributions to this magazine explored further through this panel. So just a little bit of housekeeping for the panel today. We actually, for those of you who have not gotten a copy of the BC History magazine, we will be doing a giveaway for 2 copies. We'll be sending out a feedback survey link at the end of the panel. So those of you who fill out the survey will be entered into a draw for a free copy. That will be shipped to you or picked up at the Chinese Canadian Museum, whichever you desire. So we hope that you can stay until the end so that you can have your chance at getting a free article. But in the meantime, if you haven't read any of the articles yet, Imogene Lim's article, which is on the Chinese English phrase book, is available online for free through the BC History website. So we'll pop that link in the chat in a little bit. Today's panel is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel in a few days. So keep an eye out for that if you have to miss any of this or would like to forward it on to any of your friends and family. And we will save some time for questions later on. This panel will be moderated by Aimee, and she has some really great questions for everyone, but we want to also include some audience questions in there. So if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer some of those in real time towards the end, also maybe interspersed throughout the panel. Yeah, so to introduce Aimee, Aimee Greenaway is the managing editor of the British Columbia History magazine and also curator at the Nanaimo Museum. She's a 6th-generation Nanaimo resident who grew up in the former coal mining town of Extension. Aimee has a Bachelor of Education and History from the Vancouver Island University, which sparked her passion for local history. And really cool fun fact about Aimee is that she lives on a farm near Nanaimo and plays the harp. So I'll pass it on to Aimee to introduce the rest of our speakers and get the panel rolling.
Thank you, Rosalie. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very honored to be here tonight as the moderator. This has been a very exciting and rewarding issue to be a part of. So some of you might be familiar with BC History Magazine, but for those of you who are not, it is published by the nonprofit BC Historical Federation, and there's a couple of board members of the BCHF who are also panelists tonight. Um, the winter issue was summed up very well by the issue's guest editor, Megan Koyanagi, who described that the issue highlights the diverse backgrounds and rich histories and stories of Chinese Canadians outside the Lower Mainland, where Chinese Canadian identities were erased. Present day Chinatowns have become rich with culture, familiarity, and tradition, but this issue of BC history reveals that this unified culture and history belongs to its people rather than simply to its physical spaces. Belonging is centered around the people in the community more than the physical spaces. Chinese people were not always afforded space in other physical spaces. Belonging is then tied not only to the shared identity of a group of people, but also to the solidarity shared within the community. And of course, this panel aptly takes place during Heritage Week. The theme this year is pastimes in pastimes. And of course, you should stick around till the end to get a link to potentially win a copy of the winter issue. But there are other ways to get a copy as well. CCM has a couple of special promotions going on. Visitors who bring in a copy to the front desk at CCM can receive 10% off annual passes. This is valid until March 1st. They also have a couple of issues there for sale. And you can also go to the British Columbia History website and buy individual issues or subscriptions. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and after I've done that, they're going to share a brief summary of their articles. So I'll start with Catherine Clement. This is alphabetical order, just to mix things up. Her article was called "A Match Not Made in Heaven." Catherine developed, curated, and designed the paper trail to the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, a national exhibition and community archive that commemorates the 100th anniversary of this dark period in Canadian history. Catherine is perhaps best known for her 10-year search uncovering the hidden works of Yu Chou, Vancouver's first and most prolific Chinese photographer. That project resulted in an exhibition of crowdsourced materials in 2019, a book in 2020, and a comprehensive community archive of over 600 private photos taken by Yu Chou. Dr. Imogene Lim wrote Beyond Chinatown, the Chinese and English Phrasebook. Dr. Lim is a descendant of Cumberland and Vancouver Chinatowns and an anthropologist by trade. Dr. Lim's expertise in Chinese Canadian communities, especially on Vancouver Island, spans well over 2 decades. Her work has included collaborations with local museums. She is also a founding member of the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC. She co-developed the exhibit 150 Years and Counting, Fighting for Justice on the Coast. She served as an exhibition advisory committee member for A Seat at the Table and co-curated the pop-up exhibit, Dishing Up Memories, Eating Chinese in BC for the Chinese Canadian Museum in 2022. Dr. Lim was a 2020 Province of BC Medal for Good Citizenship recipient. Dr. Sarah Ling wrote Canned Salmon and China Lily, Chinese and Indigenous Relations in Small Town, British Columbia. Sarah oversees exhibitions and collections at the Chinese Canadian Museum. Since joining the museum when it was first established in 2020, she has co-curated and managed several of the museum's inaugural exhibitions, including Odysseys and Migration, and Reshaping Collections, where history meets art, which is fantastic. You should go see it. Dr. Ling was born and raised in Prince Rupert, BC, with ancestral ties to Toisan, China, and Hong Kong. As a documentary filmmaker, she has produced award-winning films that center Chinese Canadian histories. She is an active volunteer in Vancouver, Chinatown, and currently serves on the British Columbia Historical Federation Board. And not so uncommon an oath, the chicken oath in BC Chinese Canadian testimonies, written by Andrew Sanford Marchese. Andrew is an independent researcher and museum worker, passionate about preserving and sharing Chinese Canadian history. Raised in Minnesota, Andrew draws on his own family roots to explore movement and settlement patterns that shape the community in Vancouver. Through work at the UBC Rare Books and Special Collections, the Chinese Canadian Museum, and projects like the 1923 Paper Trail, Andrew develops educational programming, leads tours, and supports public archival engagement. His personal research centers untold stories, especially those of working class Chinese bachelor men, reflecting his belief in history that is felt deeply and shared openly. And last, but certainly not least, Elwyn Shi, sharing stories of my Chinese community. Elwyn is one of the inaugural museum assistants at the Chinese Canadian Museum, leading acclaimed tours and providing exhibition interpretation for visitors. Born in Chinatown in Vancouver and raised in the family business, Union Laundry, during the 1960s, Elwyn attended the inner city schools of Strathcona Elementary and Britannia Secondary. Alongside his siblings, he worked at the family business, after school, and on weekends. Elwyn's deep family roots run parallel to the history of the Chinese in Canada. Railroad construction, head tax, 1923 Exclusion Act, paper sons, and even an indentured servant girl, Wheatsai, within the narrative. So to make sure that we all have an idea of what these articles are about, I'd like to ask the authors to share a brief intro to some of the key points for them about their article. And it would be ideal to start with Dr. Lim, because her article is the first featured article in the magazine, and that was a very deliberate choice to set the tone for the rest of the magazine with Dr. Lim's article. So if you could take it away, please.
Thank you for the introduction, and I think the opportunity for being part of this panel, because it's wonderful to be with people that have such a close tie to the Chinese Canadian Museum in all different ways. So as Rosalie said, part of this session is decentering Chinatowns and thinking of Vancouver and Victoria. So the majority of people, when they think of Chinatown, of course, they think of the oldest, which is Victoria. And then they think of the biggest, which is Vancouver. But I am located on the traditional unceded territory of the Nanaimo people. So that's Nanaimo. And for many people, especially newcomers, they don't even think that Nanaimo had a Chinatown. So this was an opportunity to talk about, well, what about all these other places? And part of the what about all these other places is that I looked at the Chinese and English phrase book and dictionary. And most people, actually, when I first received it, I thought, oh, it's just a dictionary. And then I flipped through it and I thought, whoa, this is really interesting. This is social history. And the thing that caught my eye, because there's a lot of different types of research that can be done with this particular book, but something that was accessible and that was approachable from a number of different angles is the fact that it lists place names, and it had BC place names. And I thought, oh, well, who's on this list? And there's over 200 names. So right off, it's like, okay, this is a dictionary, and it's specifically targeting early Chinese immigrants. So if there's 200 plus place names, that means these places are significant to the population for whatever reasons. You wanted to know that this place existed. So one of the things that I hope to do at some point is to chart out where all these locations are. So some of them really resonated with me immediately because when people think of Nanaimo, they don't realize that it is an amalgamation of smaller communities. So one of the things that I saw in the dictionary, it had Departure Bay. So people that are traveling from Horseshoe Bay Ferry, they're going to Departure Bay. And here, this is very specific. And again, if you're from the Mid-Island, or Nanaimo more specifically, you know that Wellington, Cedar, Northfield, these are names that are now part of Nanaimo, but back then they were separate. So that means they're very unique locations where Chinese people had an interest. So then the question is, what is it that was what were they interested in? Was it because of agriculture? Was it because of mining? Was it because of the indigenous community? So there's all these different things. Anyways, that's sort of like a little snapshot. There's lots to say about this. And for me, it's really exciting to sort of dig in to be that geographic nerd as to where these places are and to dig deeper. What was the reason for the interest?
Fantastic. Thank you, Imogene. Catherine, could you give us some background on or an overview of your article, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Aimee. So my touches on starts actually in Cumberland. This story starts in Cumberland that I found and winds up, working its way through Bowser on Vancouver Island and then over to courtrooms in Vancouver and Victoria. But at its essence, it's called A Marriage Not Made in Heaven. So it kind of gives people an idea what it's going to be about. But at the core of this story is a lost story from 1931 that was really a big story at the time. It made even the English newspaper headlines. And at its core is a young, feisty Chinese Canadian-born woman who's 24 years old and who ends up in order to extract herself from a bad marriage and to keep her children, winds up staring down and actually having to get into this huge battle with not only her husband, but with the Wong Clan Association. And if anyone knows anything about clan association, especially back then, the Wongs were the biggest and the baddest and the most powerful and influential clan association. And they took her on. And so it's very much the story of what happened. And how brave she was to actually go through this. She was basically more or less on her own, fighting them, and just because, as I said, she wanted to keep her children. And it also allows you to realize the impact of exclusion, because this story starts actually the year the Exclusion Act comes in, when she is forced into a marriage with a man who's much older than her and who is from China and already has a family. And it also is very revealing about the role of children at that time, especially young male children, and how because there were so few Canadian-born children in Canada, each one was precious. It was a legacy. And so this was the main reason why she had to go to battle against the Wong Clan Association, is because those children were considered the husbands and they were very special. So it's really interesting, this back and forth, and how brave she is and how they take her on, how the newspapers describe her as being very Western and Parisian in her dress. Really fascinating. And I felt like I had to tell this story because she's been lost. There's so few stories of women, and hers is a remarkable story.
Thank you, Catherine. Sarah, could you please tell us about your article?
Yes, and thank you, Aimee, for the intro earlier, but I wanted to make a slight correction for the record that I humbly am not a doctor. I did do my master's, but do not deserve to be called Dr. Ling, so I'm just Sarah.
My
But
apologies.
no worries. No disrespect to Dr. Lim. My piece is called Can Salmon and China Lily? Chinese and Indigenous Relations in Small Town, British Columbia. And I think it really piggybacks off nicely from Imogene's article. And it really speaks close to home because I was born and raised in Prince Rupert, which to me is a small town, but realizing that in reading Imogene's work and talking to other people that there are much smaller towns than Prince Rupert itself. But to me, it's small. It's located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Somaliac-speaking peoples, and it's surrounded by dozens of Indigenous villages up and down the coast. And to me, I reflect on how the histories of Chinese Canadians across Canada is deeply linked to the peoples of the territories of those host nations. And so in tracing my own family's history to my great-grandfather, Ma Bon Jack, who arrived in 1900 and paid the head tax of $100 at the time, along with his brother, Ma Bon Quan, who ended up running the largest grocery chain in town, Sunrise Grocery, and became a very prominent Chinese merchant in the community. And in following their story and how we ended up in such a remote place like Prince Rupert, I came to learn through other relatives and researchers in the family that it was through establishing relations along the coastal trade routes with Indigenous peoples that we managed to settle there and really come to be who we are today. And so I trace the journey of Ma Bon Quan, who met two other Chinese settlers in Barkerville on their way up north. And they had come to learn the local carrier and Tsimshian languages through their time being in relation with the local peoples. And even in Prince Rupert itself, which used to have dozens of canneries, which are now sadly all closed, in looking at the Somaliac language, there's a term for jeans, which translates to China pants, but it's really about how the local Indigenous peoples met Chinese cannery workers. And so it's about being in relation with those people. So it really makes me think about a line that Imogene wrote in her piece that said, people makes the place. And so, yeah, I share many examples and other stories of how Chinese and Indigenous peoples have been in relationship with each other for many centuries.
Thank you, Sarah. Andrew, could you please share some information about your article with us?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And again, it's an honor to be a part of this panel. And thank you to Aimee and BC Historical Federation for this amazing issue and opportunity to share space with so many mentors and amazing researchers. My piece was about kind of an unusual part of BC's legal history, something that has come up in past writings, maybe as a footnote, which is the so-called chicken oath, which involves a chicken and an oath, and also a number of other accoutrements and ritual items. And it was a key part of how Chinese Canadians found a place of belonging in an institution that was often very hostile to them, which was the courts and the legal system here in the colony of British Columbia, from small town and small claims courts all the way to the BC Supreme Court. These various oaths involving the burning of paper, the burning of candles and incense, and at its highest level, the sacrifice of a living chicken. These oaths were a part of BC's history since the beginning of widespread Chinese presence here during the Fraser Gold Rush, and again, were widespread from small towns to big cities. I want to really talk a little bit about how I came across this interesting historical legal thing, which was through newspapers. I think, like many researchers, I can go down rabbit holes, and newspapers.com is an amazing tool for genealogists and researchers. And as was mentioned in my intro, I work a lot with the stories of what we often call in Chinese Canadian history bachelor men, or men who had a family in China, kind of a binational or trans-Pacific almost life, where they would go back and visit family and live in work camps here in BC, or in what we would call SRO hotel rooms and Chinatowns, or rooming houses, lumber camps, coal mines, canneries. And oftentimes in those places, living in close proximity with one another, they got into conflicts with one another over money, or gambling, or women, or anything really that anyone would fight each other over. But when brought to court, there was an issue in terms of figuring out what oath or what way to swear in to tell the truth was going to work for these men as non-Christians, or as people with a different cultural or religious background than the Anglo-Protestant majority here. And so this oath, which comes from Southern Chinese culture, from the brotherhoods, the sworn brothers and secret societies, became widely used. And so through the testimonies and stories of these men as they appear, little glimpses of bachelors across BC in the court records, I was able to kind of expand on this history. And there's a lot more out there, of course, in this area to talk about, but it was very, very exciting to get a little intro in with this lovely issue.
Thanks, Andrew. Elwyn, could you share your article with us, which is really a lot about your work at the Chinese Canadian Museum?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Excuse me. 今晚我想多謝你哋參觀我哋嘅講故室啊。今晚我想多謝我系隊那人阿伯、阿叔、阿爺、阿婆、公仔、阿爺爺，佢哋係呢老華僑移民過嚟加拿大，以前嘅好多夫。那世人真係好煩我哋那廣東人，其實做啲政府工，希望我下一代我哋一剎唔使掛政府啊，所以我多謝佢哋。In Yinping Cantonese, the village dialect, I said that tonight I thank you all for joining us in our webinar. I honor our Lowa Q trailblazers who left China because it was so difficult, for a better place, not just for themselves, but for the next generations, so that us here and those of you that are watching could have a better life and to remember them. So it gives me great pleasure to have contributed to this magazine. I was with the Chinese Canadian Museum since day one of the paper trail. And when I first started working there, I was shocked twice. The first time I saw my Aunt Sylvia in the documentary Everlasting. I thought I saw her once, and then I saw her again. It's one of those where you blink, you miss her, but sure enough, there was my Aunt Sylvia, and what was she doing in the video? She was the bridesmaid to Art Yip and Molly Yip. And at first I thought, is that possible? I've heard these stories, and I wasn't really paying attention. And when I contacted Linda Yip and she sent me these photographs, and there was my Aunt Sylvia. I need to tell you that our family were not city slickers on Pender Street. Our family were pig farmers, greengrocer farmers on Lulu Island. So there's a bit of a socioeconomic difference. So I had no idea, like, what are my Aunt Sylvia doing hanging out with them? It turns out they were linked by a a Chinese ghost marriage, whereby my uncle John passed away early. Molly also had a sister that died early, and this tradition, which I've since done some research, they were paired off in the afterlife, and that explains why Molly would come to our family dinners, even though we didn't share a common surname. But I'll talk to you a little bit about the other item that I was shocked about. That is the muizai. I will let you know that when I was growing up, I didn't know of that term. I knew that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was, we used the term ama, or sometimes a nanny. And it's not until I walked into the training for the Chinese Canadian Museum and I saw Cui Sing Ling on the plum blossom wall, and I basically read the description and I basically fell to the ground. I honestly thought that Catherine had hacked into my computer and accessed my family folder and just downloaded my folder, my Word file on my grandmother. Because you see, when I read the description, it was literally identical to that of my grandmother. Just basically copy and paste. And you see, I've never known of this term called muizai because over the decades, I've never talked to people about my grandmother. Like, oh, do you have a grandmother that's a nanny? And like, and then which was taken care of by a rich merchant, and then paired off when they're of adult age. Had I maybe talked to other people, but it's not something that I broach with people because it's kind of a awkward topic. And honestly, even in my family, it's not something that we kind of like talk about. I guess maybe there's some shame and there's some negative connotations to that. And I've since done some research with the Chinese rescue mission in Victoria for Chinese girls that have for whatever reason wound up there. Could it be abandonment, uh, prostitution, and etc. So it's been a complete joy and eye opener for me to work at the Chinese Canadian Museum. So when I get to the plum blossom wall, uh, to make it more real to the people that are attending my tours, I actually bring out the image of my grandmother. And yeah, and there've been many times where people have broken down tears. And as much as I try to adhere to the CCM PDF script, I also try to throw in some items which come from my family, because my family is almost like a quintessential family of Chinese Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you, Elwin. Connection and the importance of stories is a great way for us to move into some questions and conversation. Question that I wanted to pose to all of the panelists is, what is the one takeaway point you want readers to consider in your article? Imogene is unmuted first.
Okay. Well, I was getting ready, so I didn't know whether you had a particular order. For me, actually, there's two takeaways. One, don't just look at the title of a book. If I just had looked at and said, oh, Chinese English phrasebook and dictionary, I would have put it aside and think, oh, it's just a dictionary. So looking at it more in-depthly, seeing what was actually in there, that's an important point. Like, I think you could get multiple theses, like graduate theses, out of this by doing it. The other takeaway And again, it's about thinking beyond how we conceive Chinatown. And this is something that Sarah raised, is these small places that early Chinese pioneers were all over the place. And so don't just look at the larger communities. Though there are those communities like, 50 miles or 50 kilometers away from whatever the center is, and they're there. So, and don't imagine like brick buildings and whatnot. One of the things that I say, and it also appears in the magazine, is the photographs of those Chinatowns. They look like any old community of 100 years ago. They're just shacks, right? And again, it's the people that make the community. So they were called Chinatowns because they were Chinese, and you can't create a Chinatown without the people. So that's my takeaway.
Thanks, Imogene. Is there anyone else that would like to take on that question? Sarah, please go ahead.
Well, I think, yeah, building off of Imogene's framework, I think, as I mentioned earlier, in looking at Chinese Canadian presence and history in BC, but also across Canada, we cannot look at it or recall it without looking at Chinese people being in relation with Indigenous peoples. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a reciprocal relationship, although that's something I focused on in my research. It might be a more complex and unbalanced history in terms of the overall narrative of settler colonialism. So I think that's really important that we always keep those relationships and interwoven histories in mind.
Can I leap in?
Yeah,
So
please
I
do.
wanted to say something because again, it's about the names. So in preparing for this panel, I of course did another read through of my paper. So one of the places that I know that was listed in as a place name is Departure Bay. And so, as I said earlier, people think of Departure Bay today as, that nice bay, but it's also where the ferry comes in. And if you're not from the area, you don't know that it was a significant Snuneymuxw village. Stililip, and I may be mispronouncing it, but it was a significant village. So this dictionary was produced, or at least it's noted that it's from 1897. So think about what was there potentially in 1897. So Indigenous peoples were there. The other thing that came up, again, I was looking through the names, and it had St. Mary's Mission. So that was in Mission. That was a residential school. So the question for me then is, why because they didn't put Mission, they put St. Mary's Mission. So Chinese were interested in it. So does that mean they were laborers connected to the mission, or was it the place name, but they were the agriculture, because it's mission, right? So were they the agricultural workers at that point in time? And that's why they were interested. But again, when you look at some of these places, they're tied to early religious organizations, whether residential school or not. So again, there's that tie-in.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Imogene. There's so much to unpack, so many layers. Catherine, is there something you'd like to add, or would you like to tell us what your takeaway is?
It's not really, it's probably not really a takeaway. I mean, maybe it is, it's an observation. I was saying, so this is the paper trail. It was the second major project I've done where I've collected, like crowdsourced, collected, scanned, and then every time we scanned something, the idea was to pick up the story of the person who was in that photograph in the Yu Cho Chow project, or in this case, it was who owned that CI certificate initially. And universally, in both projects, when it came to hearing stories of women, it was usually, even with biographies, oh, well, she liked to cook and garden, she stayed home. And that's kind of the extent. So when you go through a lot of these two collections that I've done, there's very little on women. So it was fascinating to find this story of this woman. As I said, it made headlines, like pages after pages of headlines in even in the English newspapers. And to realize that there are these little gems that are out there. They're hard as hell to find. But sometimes you get lucky and you stumble upon it, or somebody gives you a little bit of a clue that you park in your brain, and then a few years later, and in this case, that's what happened on this, all of a sudden, the story comes together. You find the missing piece that brings the story together. So I guess it's just now, I just want more people to feel, just to pay more attention to women's stories, and to make an effort when they find them is to tell them, because some of these women are remarkable what they did.
Elwin.
Yes, sorry, I just had a coughing fit there. So just further to what Imogene was talking about, I don't know if it's clear to people about this phrase book, and I've got a phrase book right here. I don't know if you can see it. So in this phrase book, I'll give you an example. It says here, have you a house to rent? So the top part above the English is basically, have you a house to rent? But on the bottom part is the Toy San tones phonetics of have you a housey to lent. So not everybody knows that, so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I think just to carry on with where I left off earlier, I would say that for families that have come into the paper trail, looking for your family or doing a genealogical search is so much easier today because everything's so digitized. When I did my genealogical search like 25, 30 years ago, I did things the hard way before digitization. And now there are all these tools. There's the UBC ACAM Kaiping tours. So even if you're not sure where your ancestral roots are, the universities at both ends can help do the heavy lifting for you. And it's not, if your language skills are iffy, no problem. They just need some basic information, and the academics can just really be so helpful. And every time I talk to someone that comes back from these tours, it's like a life-changing event. So really, there's no excuse. If you think that you have a modicum of interest, do it.
I was going to make mention that Naomi Louis has been the amazing research assistant, and I believe she's still going to be continuing that. Somebody can correct me otherwise. Sarah?
Still offering research hours along with Huabin Zhao, another staff member.
So again, as Elwin says, if you've got that interest, there are well-qualified people to help you. So putting in that plug for the Chinese Canadian Museum and the research assistants.
Conversations about research and going to libraries seems like the perfect time to talk with Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, there are, like Elwin said, there are amazing digital resources out there, but there are also amazing physical archives. If you really want to sleuth it and get into dusty boxes and look at old physical documents, where I work full time at UBC Rare Books and Special Collections, we're really lucky to host the Wallace and Madeline Chung collection, which is free to access for any member of the public, no matter where you are. In Canada, unaffiliated with UBC, you can make an appointment and request material there from 10 to 2 from Rare Books and Special Collections. And there are amazing things in there. There are Chinese restaurant menus, which I know Imogene is very, very passionate about, but have a connection to many families who ran Chinese Canadian cafes. There are association books, which relates to the piece by Larry Chin, who is not with us tonight, but contributed an amazing piece about clan associations and societies in the edition. But yes, I think there's a wealth of knowledge out there, not just in maybe UBC, but in Barkerville, amazing collection of materials in Barkerville, a manual actually of the Chinese Freemasons, or the Qi Gong Tong. One of their oldest branches were up there, and they used the chicken oath, actually kind of tangential connection to my piece, but they used the chicken sacrifice, or different versions of it, to initiate members into their brotherhood, which is one of the original uses of this oath outside of a Western legal court. But for example, one of the few surviving manuals of rituals relating to that particular major Chinese Canadian organization is up there in Barkerville. In an archive where maybe you'll go and camp at the historic site, but not know that there's a family research relevant or historically relevant collection just in a house nearby. So same could be said for places like Nelson and Vernon and Kamloops and Castlegar and all of these amazing places where Chinese Canadians were finding a way to make a living, and help one another. In shacks, like Imogene said, or in fields, or out in the bush, really. So there's a really great wealth of stuff in archives if you want to kind of take a road trip too as well.
Thank you. I always love hearing research tips. Added that to the list. Catherine, I have a question for you directly. Ma Hang has an incredible story. How do you think her willingness to legally push back against her husband and the Wong's Benevolent Association reflects on her as a person, and how it can possibly help us understand her expectations on her role as a Chinese Canadian woman in the 1920s and 30s?
That's a loaded question. I mean, it's interesting if you think the time that she grows up. So she's born in Cumberland, and she's born to a merchant family, and she spends a lot of time in the store, and she's educated. But she's also growing up during a time when the flapper movement is happening in the US. Skirts are getting shorter, women are getting more liberated. There's a whole different role for women that's starting to emerge during that period of time. And she's seeing this in magazines, the way that they describe her dress in the court cases. So just so people know, the Wong Association takes her on 2 court cases at the same time as an effort to try to get the children and to keep them here. And so they hurl some accusations at her, and it's actually very revealing of what she's doing, because she's actually supporting her kids on her own. But I feel that she's not the first story that we've come across, that we've discovered through the paper trail research, where a young woman is taking on her father's wishes, forcing her, like she's forced into a marriage and then wants out of it for whatever reasons. And almost always these marriages are with men who are from China and who have been here in Canada for quite a while and are significantly older. And so she, I still though find it startling to imagine how brave she was to take this on. She would go from one court case to the next, right? They were both happening simultaneously. And she's doing it on her own. Obviously, there was some backing. There was probably the Ma Clan Society financed her lawyers, because she does have a white lawyer. And so somebody is helping her. But in the end, it doesn't end up so great for her. She winds up losing 2 of her children in this. And so it just reminds you that it's very much a man's world still. And she does lose her children, but I think it's just, as I said, fascinating because there's so few women's stories, especially women that are brave, and a Chinese woman. So women were, at the bottom of the heap, but being a Chinese woman, you were even lower status in society. So it's remarkable to see someone who at 24, it stands up against them. So this Mexican standoff, with with the Long Association.
Thank you, Catherine. It's such a phenomenal story. I remember when you were talking with me about it, and I was just absolutely blown away. And I think that stories are such an important part of how this issue came together and as part of our conversation tonight. And so I have a question for Elwyn, because I know that you have many great stories and connections to the community. Are there any interactions with museum guests that really stand out for you on some of your tours?
Oh, there were so many. Um, quite often after I give the tours, and I guess they feel a little relaxed with me, and many many attendees would just like all of a sudden open up and spill their guts about their family and how so and so, and this can go on for several minutes, and I'm trying to keep track of all these people in their family, and it's difficult because I don't know, I guess maybe I'm like a sounding board or a therapy session, and it's like they've been waiting for years, maybe decades, to share this with someone. Maybe their kids or their spouses don't want to hear about it, or maybe it's because I'm a complete stranger that they can spill their guts with me because it's not going to go anywhere. And I really try to concentrate on who all the players are. And it's just a lot of stories of alienation, dysfunction, not knowing who your maybe your parent is, or where they've become, because of the separation due to exclusion, they become complete strangers, and sometimes there's no reconciling. Like even like my good friend Sid Tan's a case in point, and I mean it just affected him so much that he had to take on the entire movement and the whole head tax thing because it affected him so deeply that he couldn't get along with his parents. And many people would just uh, like I'm not trained in counseling and this type of thing. Like I'm just a I'm just a humble guide, you know. And it's great that they get emotional about it, and then from that point on, I think based on what you've just told me, it sounds like you've got a CI 44 in your family. And furthermore, based on what else you've told me, I think there's a CI9 document that should be found. So follow me. I'll take you downstairs to the research room. And when I take them there, and when like Naomi and Huabin, they do their thing, or Andrew at the time, they would thank me profusely because they came in to the museum thinking that they would spend, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes tops. And it turns into like a 2, 3 hour thing. Sometimes they got to excuse themselves. I got to go out for lunch, or I got to go and put more money into my parking. And then it's like what was supposed to be like a 45-minute thing has turned into a 2, 3 hour thing. And then they finish off by, oh, I gotta bring my grandkids here. They gotta know about this story. They must know about my father and my grandfather. So it gets very emotional, and I get emotional for them and with them as well. And I have to tell you that working at the Chinese Canadian Museum for the last year and a half, 2 years, has been a very has been a very fulfilling job. I mean, I've had a lot of jobs, but this one is enabled me to assist people in helping them to find their genealogical roots. And they are so shocked because for many people, they've never seen their grandfather, just like me, because their grandfather passed away before they were born. And when they first see some of these documents, they're not quite sure. But then when all the facts line up and they realize this is indeed their grandfather or their grandmother, they break down in tears. I mean, you can ask anyone that works in the research room, whether it's Andrew or Naomi, that people break down in tears. And yeah, it's been very rewarding. Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to sort of leap into what Elwyn has been talking about. It's intergenerational trauma. And so the Chinese community has not called it out for what it is. So when you think about it, so it's not just those that got left behind. Well, when they got left behind, but then they come during reunification, like family reunification, you have parents that haven't seen one another for 20 years. So like in Nanaimo, there's a, case, and I actually met the individuals about, I didn't know at that time, I didn't know the background. And then I read in the local newspaper, it's like, married for 60 years, but only together for 40. Well, what does that do for social relations? Not just for the couple, but the children. So you've got, a 17 or 18-year-old coming over, seeing their father for the first time and sort of figuring out, well, who's this guy? And then because, people married young, or, the women were young, they had their second, third, fourth kid when most people are not thinking of having children. So you've got this big age gap. So what does it mean to have a Canadian-born kid plus the kid that was born back in the village? They're all coming together and, different kinds of attitudes, expectations. So it all leads to intergenerational trauma. And I think we need to call it out for what it is and say, it happened to our community as well. It's not just, those other communities. And we all know which communities I'm speaking of, but it is a real thing for the Chinese Canadian community. So just my little rant.
I'll just mention that because with that, there's a bit of well, there's not a bit, quite a bit of embarrassment, a bit of humiliation, pain, and it's something that I think it's been kind of swept underneath the carpet. It's not something that we as a community has wanted to deal with.
While we're talking about the paper trail and the documents that have been digitized and made available, I wondered if Catherine or Andrew or anyone would like to speak to guest interactions at the museum with these documents, or if there's anyone that would has anything further that they'd like to say about what these documents mean to their families specifically.
Well, I think both Elwyn and Andrew spent more time on the floor than I did. I would give tours and I'd start tearing up. Like I had to really, even months after, like just even at the very end, the very last tour, I still found myself really affected by this story, the stories. I mean, one of the things that we tried to do in the exhibition is to really bring it very much down to the human experience of exclusion, to look at different individual stories and how the exclusion period played out in people's lives. And of course, one of the areas where, especially I know Andrew has a soft spot for, and so do I, are the men, the many men who were deeply affected by exclusion, especially those for whom exclusion never ended. So even when it did end in 1947, the ripple effects of that continued on for at least another 30 years for many men who never returned home and never had their families join them. And it was a life sentence, basically. And I think once you see that, and once you hear about, how when it was first coming down, and the amount of stories, again, we discovered this in the newspaper, nobody told us about this, the number of men that started to take their lives just out of despair, men who had been here 30, 40 years in Canada, and yet this is what took them down. This is what brought them to their knees, was this act. It's hard, unless you have no empathy at all, it's hard not to be affected when you hear that. So I know, Andrew, you also, maybe you should add, because you shared some really good things with me over time about how, especially in the Bachelor's Alley.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was on the paper trail project as a researcher, but like Catherine mentioned, was at CCM actually since 2020, but since the exhibit was installed. And I think the Bachelor's Alley is definitely, for me, it was a life-changing experience to work on it. And I think for many visitors to really see the pieces come together in that part of the installation and say, oh, that older guy who took me out to get pie or to go to the movie theater, he wasn't just some old crony of my dad's. He was a part of our chosen family, is a word that people use, or part of our social circle and part of our life here as a family. And I think when there is such intergenerational trauma, but there also is the trauma of seeing the loss of stories that came with the separation of exclusion. And the people who wrote the Exclusion Act in 1923, they looked at the statistics of the Chinese population that they had from the census and from the surveillance of the community that they had done. And they knew that by separating families, they were going to reduce the birth rate. This was an intentional thing. We see it in their letters. And they made calculations, and they said, this was a quote I saw once, within 20 or 30 years, our Chinese problem will be solved. This was the ultimate goal of exclusion. And we see its fruit today. In the 2021 census of Canada, there were about 1.7 million Chinese Canadians. Out of that group, there are only about 2.5% that are third generation or more. Despite that's about 60 or 70,000 people out of 1.7 million Chinese Canadians in the country. And Chinese people have been here since 1788. That is a statistical breakdown of what exclusion does. And I think the Bachelor's Alley space and the exhibit, or the release of records along with paper trail, the release of CI-44s, registrations under the Exclusion Act, has allowed us to look and see the faces of the families that couldn't become Canadian or were not allowed to thrive here. And there is such a loss. There's such an incalculable loss, a loss of stories and a loss of the best years of tens of thousands of people who came here as children and aged here, and either died here or tried to go to their home villages and their families and didn't make it. So I think for people to be confronted with this history in its real ugliness, but also the resilience that shines through in the paper trail, has been transformative for so many, not just Chinese Canadians, but people of Jewish background, Indigenous background, South Asian, Sikh background, and beyond, Japanese Canadians as well.
Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, I found Catherine, Andrew, the whole team's work invaluable myself, because in preparation for my article for this magazine, I've been really busy at the museum, like we all have been. And so I said, Naomi, can you help me look up my great-grandfather? I've never seen any photographs of him. And like within minutes, because Naomi's like a super fast researcher and has been doing this for many months, like Andrew, Hobin, and others. She found all of his CIs, his CI9, CI44s, and here I, saw my great-grandfather for the first time, sent it to my sister and other relatives right away. So it can be part of that healing journey as well, for those of us who don't have a lot of records or have had this history passed down due to that intergenerational trauma. And then I started looking into the online records that have been released through the work of the Paper Trail team and Catherine's advocacy. And then came across a lot of CIs, which I wrote about, that show the children of mixed Chinese and Indigenous marriages in places like Duncan, Ashcroft, Fort Steele, all of these little places that many of us have probably never visited or paid much attention to. And so I think there are so many more stories and rabbit holes that Catherine mentioned, and all of these clues that can really help tie stories together and, yeah, fill in these missing pieces that many of us have been searching for.
Thank you. I have a question for everyone. I'm always interested in the research that goes into these articles, and I'm sure that many of the people who are here tonight are as well. And is there any information in your article or in the research that went into your article that surprised you or was unexpected?
I'm going to jump in here.
Please do.
So I wanted to use examples to sort of make the point of that these were interesting places in of themselves. And so I was using the geographical names of BC. So it is an online thing. You can plunk in a place name and it will show you on a map. And if it has any historical notes, it will add it in. So clearly I was made to write this article because I randomly chose McDame Creek. Like, I had no idea where it was in the province, first of all. So I looked it up and then I find out it's in the Cassiar district. So that's the northwest corner of BC. So it's way up there. And then I realize that it's referencing a prospector, and he's one, they believe that he was part of the, what is it, 1858 Black community that was brought up from San Francisco. So here we have Black Canadian history tied to this name. And so that was a really nice revelation for me. So now it's like, gee, I should look at all these names and see, are they attached to other miners or other communities that we don't talk about their histories. So when you think, it is Black History Month, right? So when you think about it, how many of these individuals that were here early on do we talk about? And here's this place. And obviously McDame was there. And then the Chinese discovered that they should maybe go check it out too. So it's a nice way to again talk about relationships between other communities. So that for me was a really nice point and something worth taking a closer look at some of these other place names.
There often seems to be no end to the projects that come out of other projects. Andrew?
Yeah, I think coming to this project, I really came to it by approaching this research through the networks that were really important to these bachelor men, which were networks of surname, of workplace, of town, and of brotherhood, of sworn brotherhood, of relating to one another, who you gambled with, who you drank with, who you hung out with in the back of the grocery store, the laundry, or the Chinese Canadian cafe, but also through the people who actually kind of made these cultural oaths, which had existed in China for a long time, part of legal system, which were interpreters and brokers. And I think all of us who have done research in Chinese Canadian history will see these names, or even if you're doing family history, you'll see the names of people who were interpreting, people like Juan Alexander Camyao, the first Chinese Canadian born in Canada, but also other people, including two men who kind of wrote the formal version of the Chicken Oath, Yip Wing and Charlie Lu Fuk, who were both interpreters who served from Nanaimo and Victoria to New Westminster and all over. and you'll see them in the courts. And these interpreters were very, very powerful people who were the face of the community, who were savvy, who were lawyers really at a time where Chinese couldn't practice law officially. And it was great through the research process of this piece to learn more about them and their role in associations. I mean, both of them were members of the Chinese Freemasons, the Qigong, which by some estimates was composed of about 76 or 78% of all Chinese Canadians before 1930. So these organizations, which are kind of sometimes made invisible to the next generation through, old folks not talking about what they're doing at that banquet where the Johnny Walker is on the table and telling you to be quiet and listen to the speeches or not listen to the speeches. I mean, a lot of these things are really part of the experience of Lowakyu Chinese Canadians, but they were central to the lives of many, many British Columbians of Chinese descent from small towns to big cities. So it was part of the research process to kind of get into those networks and really see them and not try to bring any preconceptions to it, but acknowledge it as what it was. It was a form of family in the face of oppression.
Thank you. Catherine.
Well, this actually, when I first came across this story, I wasn't planning to research it. It was about 2015 or 2016, and I was interviewing a World War II veteran. And we always, ask them questions about where you're born and also just where you grew up. And there was this one veteran, his name was Tommy Wong, really gruff guy, but heart of gold, but really gruff on the exterior. And he couldn't tell me much about his childhood, but he said, I just have this one memory, I'm about 5 years old, and I'm on a ship with my brother, and we're holding onto the railing, and then suddenly the police come on, and my grandfather gets arrested, and all hell breaks loose. And so that's all he could tell me, and I sort of put it off to the side. But several years later, Jeffrey Wong, who is with the Wong's Clan Association, I think a vice president there, also a really good friend of Andrew's, really nice guy. One day he emails me because he knows I know Tommy Wong, the veteran, and he said, I just found buried deep this old musty scrapbook. And it's about this custody trial and these trials that we were involved in against this woman and trying to save these kids. And here, all of a sudden, the rest of the story opened up, and they had the original Chinese news. We can't even find these Chinese newspapers, whatever they were, that printed some of these stories. And all the letters that went back, they fundraised across Canada to raise money to take this woman to court. It was incredible. And then from there, my research began by also starting to look through the newspapers and finding all this, dozens of newspaper articles on this. And it was such a thing for the Chinese to actually be in court with each other in this fight. So it became, as I said, something the media was very interested in. So it was all, kind of gathered steam quite by accident.
Elwin, I think I saw you unmute earlier. Did you have something you'd like to share?
Yeah, but I forgot what it was. Can I just talk about something else from that field? So I'll let you folks know that I've been doing genealogical research since my 20s without the assistance of parents, basically. And I guess you could say I had a bit of a head start on looking for my roots kind of thing. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you that even though I was involved with the head tax movement of head tax redress, which went on for decades, I had no idea about what all these different CI numbers meant, like the CI4, CI5, CI28, CI36, CI40. It's just like my eyes just kind of glazed over. So I decided that I was going to help out with the issue by getting involved with AV because this stuff was just over my head. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that I stared at my Uncle John's beige certificate CI45 for years and years and years and didn't know what it was about until I got involved with the paper trail exhibition. And I learned that it was like the Chinese community, it was like like the mandatory registration for more or less the local born kids. And the years right on this, like 1923, of course, no lights went on upstairs. But the silver lining of this is because my Uncle John, like I mentioned earlier, he died at the age of 7. And that is the only photograph that the family has of my Uncle John because of the mandatory registration. It's got a photograph, most likely taken at the Yucho Chow. So even though this head tax and exclusion and mandatory registration, for the most part, it's been a very traumatic item for the community. But there has been some silver linings. And that silver lining is that because of that mandatory registration, we are able to go back 100 years later and look up these things, find out what these individuals looked like, what their signature, what their occupation was, their facial peculiarities on them, etc. The other silver lining is because, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, my father went to China to marry my mom in the year 1936 to get an education. But while he was there, he was kind of like suckered into, oh, by the way, did you say you're age 16? Oh, you're the perfect age to get married. We've got the girl for you. So my dad married my mom, and my mom was age 15. And what happened in 1936, 37? Well, the Japanese came in. So my father, with his Canadian passport, he hightailed it back to Canada. But my mother, who did not have a Canadian passport, uh, and she was subject to the Exclusion Act, she could not come over. So my parents were well, they were separated for 11 of those 23 years. So by the time that my mother did come over in 1948, right after the repeal, and then my eldest brother is born the next year in 49. It means that I grew up speaking English to my father, but Yinping Cantonese to my mother, which makes me bilingual now. In a backhanded way, I have to thank the Canadian government for being bilingual today, if you know what I mean.
Thank you, Elwyn. I have a question for everyone. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to share how their topic can help us engage with the present. You know, that's come through a little bit already with the telling of truths, but are there other ways that you see your topic helping us have discussions today?
Simply put, it's telling lesser told stories. You know, like so again, people, okay. I guess there's two different things. One is that the elders in the community, it's a reminder to ask and to sort of encourage the particular stories that they might hold. Because I remember when I was much younger and my father was still alive, I thought, oh, he has the coffee clutch at the Newtown Bakery. I'm gonna go down there and be the, you know, like the fly on the wall. And I go there, and of course, I didn't do it right. I should have, you know, and I wasn't living in Vancouver, so it made it awkward, you know, like if I was just sort of like there constantly at my father's side for like over a month's period, they would have gotten used to me. I would have start hearing stories, but you know, I just barged in there hoping that there would be stories. And of course, they said, "Oh, your dad knows it all." So there's that aspect, you know. So, but do talk to your elders to get that stories, because this is one of the things. Like maybe it's that little snippet. So one of the things. I'm a descendant of Cumberland's Chinatown. So when some of my elders were still around, I was always asking them about Cumberland's Chinatown. I never asked them about what did you, yeah, as I say, what did you do when you grew up to be a successful, you know, person? Like what was your career? And I think one of the people is who's in the listening audience. This elder, when he passed away, they played the Beachcombers theme song. I thought, what the hey? Like, why are they playing the Beachcombers song during his memorial? And they said, then I realized he had been a sound engineer. He worked in sound, like a sound technician for CBC in Vancouver. And I'm thinking, he might have been the first Chinese Canadian working for CBC, because I knew that he had gone to school in the US to get his certification or whatever it was to work in sound. So it probably was, maybe the mid to late 50s. And so his claim to fame that meant something to him was to work on the Beachcomber, which was one of the longest, series that CBC produced, and it was local, right? But it was just like, I never asked him. And then I asked his daughter, she never asked him. So like, where are those stories? So that's a lesson to all of us, that when we work in communities that have those lesser known stories, just start talking, listen.
Thank you, Imogene. That is such a good reminder for all of us, I think, people on the panel and also people who are here with us tonight. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to how their topic can help us engage with the present?
I think I'll piggyback off of that. So at the end of my article, I have a little fun section called China Lily Through the Eras. And it's about how I noticed this a while ago, but a lot of Indigenous artists that I follow, their portfolio and their work online, have been making various renditions of the China Lily soy sauce bottle, which, if you've ever bought it or seen it in the grocery store, is this plastic bottle with a very bold yellow and black label with the words China Lily. And apparently, according to many of these artists, like Andy Everson or Ruby Bruce, and she's an Anishinaabe artist, that soy sauce is the preferred condiment for many Indigenous communities, not only in BC, but Canada and across the US. And I've seen so many renditions of this particular bottle. I think it's the 400 milliliter or 500 milliliter bottle, including this earring, which I am wearing. This is by a very talented jeweler from the Haida Nation of this bottle. And I think it's being open to, like Imogene said, listening to those stories, but looking for those intercultural connections, because these soy sauce bottles can link us to many interesting histories and stories of the ways our peoples have been brought together in the food industry, in restaurants, on farms, market gardens, and canneries, the long histories of trade, like my great granduncle who traded with the Gitsan, Haida, and Nisga'a peoples. And so I think, there are so many different journeys we can take when we look for those stories and listen to the people who have had those experiences in their communities and over the generations. So art is another really powerful avenue to explore our histories.
So I want to piggyback on the China Lily story, because I had a student from Sea Island, and so she took a course with me. So when I was teaching, I did a food and culture course, and because I talked about Chinese food, she became aware of the China Lily collection, because she would use it. She said, like, my family, we're always using China, like it's always, like China Lily and salmon, but she had no idea where it came from. So again, it's about that relationship. And then during COVID, there was a run on China Lily. So I don't know if people realized it. So again, a different student from Haida Gwaii said, oh, everybody was contacting her. It's like, can you get me China Lily? Because they had run out in Haida Gwaii, wherever, whichever store they were getting it from. And it actually became a hot commodity. So it's a reminder again about those relationships with others that we don't normally think about. And so I still am cognizant of, if I go to the big house and there's an event, they serve chow mein, like where did that come from? Or chop suey, again, where did that come from? It's again about relationships. So always a good reminder.
I also found it very funny that often these stories about putting China Lily on rice, because growing up, like my family would use it in like a stir fry or they're cooking, but never just directly on the rice itself. So it's interesting how it is used in these communities.
If there's someone else that would like to jump in on this question, I've got a question for Andrew, which came in via Imogene. And the question is, what happened to the chicken after its slaughter in the chicken oath? Your final example in your article seemed to suggest that it might be a way to get the chicken gratis. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear your speculations.
So, full disclosure, I have no documented historical evidence conclusively about what happened to any of the probably thousands of chickens who met their fate in an alleyway outside a courthouse in BC over the 100 years this was used. But I think the main thing with the chicken was that it had to be alive. So, for ancestor worship, oftentimes, for the Qingming festival or for Lunar New Year, you'll always have a chicken on the altar, right? You have a chicken, you have a fish, you have a pig. They have meaning, but it's cooked. It's like the white cut chicken, bakjigai, or it's like soy sauce chicken or something like that. But for this, you would never just take the roast chicken to outside of it and swear an oath over it as an offering. It had to be live blood. And we know that chicken is a very useful food in Chinese cuisine. And people do not waste food. All of those foods that are offered at the altar, the family will eat it, the association will eat it. Traditionally in Chinatowns, if you had made a donation for Qingming or for the banquet, you get a little envelope, and sometimes you get a little red wrapped portion of the pig, the giant suckled pig, with your name written on the red thing. So this was always about giving back to the community. So I would bet that the chicken probably made its way into the pot. One of the interesting things that we see with the chickens being sacrificed is that the white legal courts did not want to pay for the chickens or find the knives to kill the chickens. And so this was a delay tactic that Chinese Canadian brokers and courtroom translators would use to buy time for their client. So they say, my client is not a Christian. He will not, maybe the client had gone to Sunday school, the teacher had, done catechism, but the client would be like, I'm not a Christian, I would demand the chicken oath. And because the law had established that it needed to be this legitimate oath, they would have to find a chicken. But then they'd be like, well, I'm not paying that out of our defense fee. The court should supply it because they supplied the Bible. And so this was a delay tactic as well. But a dead chicken, you can make it into soup, you can make it into all manner of dishes. So I would imagine that it did end up being consumed. The question is by the defendant or by the accused or by the janitor of the courthouse or so on and so forth. But it was quite the experience. I think a lot of white folks who saw this ritual because of the stereotypes against the Chinese, they were very horrified because they saw it as like a heathen thing. But at the same time, what I wanted to make sure I said in my piece, and what I believe very clearly, is that this was a way that Chinese culture was seen as like a legitimate part of how the law unfolded in BC since the beginning. Even though a lot of people in the culture thought it was strange, it happened hundreds of times, and it was a part of the culture here.
Thank you, Andrew. Elwyn.
Just piggybacking on the chicken theme, which seems to be the theme tonight. I mentioned earlier that my uncle John died at the age of 7 in the year 1929, and he was paired off in the afterlife with Molly Mars, a sister who also died young. This took place during World War II, and it was relayed to me that the boy, my uncle John, was represented at the cemetery by a rooster. And the girl, Molly Mar's sister, Maymar, who, by the way, is buried like 6 steps away from Yip Sang, was represented by a chicken. So if you can picture at the cemetery, at Mountain View Cemetery, there's the chicken, the rooster, there's the incense, there's the candles, there's the burning of the paper, as if it was these people were alive. So I don't know why they use chicken and the rooster, but I don't know if this is just a Guangdong thing or it's a Chinese thing. But yeah, the chicken and the rooster, which one came first?
I just want to add, finally, this is still a legal oath that you can have in the courts of British Columbia. I could not find any evidence of it after 1945. There probably were some cases in the 1950s. We know that there were really, really old Chinese bachelor men in rural places like Nelson and Vernon who went into disputes, who were members of the Chinese Freemasons who still used these oaths and believed in them and relied on them. But it is technically something that if you want to bring a chicken and a hatchet to the court to swear in for your traffic violation or your disputes of any type, it is something that you can do.
Thank you very much to both of you. Great legal advice, Andrew. Thank you very much. And thank you to Rosalie for letting people know that they could post some questions for us. If you've got questions, please pop them in the Q&A. I'm just taking a look in there right now to see some of the questions.
Can I answer number 2, the first one?
Yeah, so number 2.
It says, with regard to Nanaimo, its various Chinatowns are lost because they were wooden structures. What is being done in communities like Nanaimo to mark these lost places in the China Step? Is the China Steps sufficient representation? So I wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to answer this question 2 weeks ago, but I can answer it today because I met a artist, Jackie Wong. She has commissioned the Public Art Commission from the city of Nanaimo to mark the 3 Chinatowns. So there is something being done. She's doing the research. I had a lengthy conversation with her at the Nanaimo Museum as we walked around in the Chinese exhibit, as well as the Chinatown exhibit, as well as the seat at the table. So I'm putting in a plug for Nanaimo Museum. For those of you who want to visit, it does have a Chinatown display, as well as the traveling exhibit of a seat at the table. And that ends what? End of March, right?
Correct. March 28th.
Yes. So there is going to be something. And for those who don't know, China Steps has a plaque and it says Chinatowns. And that was actually my first community engagement project, which was done, I think we did it in 1999, and then it got put up the year afterwards. So it's still it's been kicking around, and like I said, it was the first time that I got involved in the community because I was relatively new at then Malaspina University College.
In my humble opinion, Imogene, there is no other person on earth who could have just fielded that question. So how ideal that this worked out the way that it did.
So clearly it's somebody from Nanaimo asking this question.
That's spectacular. I'd like to add just a little bit to that, which is in Extension, there is a park, and there's some interpretive panels that have the history of the community, and there is reference to the Extension Chinatown in there. Is it enough? That is a big question, but there is reference. And there's a first part to that question, which is, or I guess a first question technically, does BC History Magazine work with local and regional museums to increase the diversity of the stories and artifacts at those museums, Indigenous, East Asian, and South Asian? So I can definitely share that we do work with people that work at all sorts of heritage institutions across the province. The BCHF, if no pressure, but if Sarah or Elwyn wanted to jump in, the BCHF does a lot of work with different heritage organizations as well. And I personally am grateful for opportunities like this for us to be able to share some of these lesser known stories in a public space.
Yeah, actually, the last edition was a special on the South Asian community. Can you just hang tight? I'll go and get it. Just hang tight. Yeah.
Yes, there
Just
was a
keep
great
talking.
story
Keep
in there.
talking. Keep talking.
I will keep talking. So yes, the one I think that Elwyn's referring to was the summer issue, which the cover story profiled the work in the South Asian community and the Lower Mainland, creating curriculum resources that can be used by BC teachers. In the earlier this year, earlier 2024, there was an issue that was themed around people from the Fijian community. So there we go. Maybe a little bit closer to you, Elwyn. It's disappearing in the green screen. The amazing disappearing man. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. The green screen thing is just affecting the image. It's the summer 2024, and it's a special on the stories in here are Indo-Fijians, Our Long Journey Home, more about the Fiji, interviews with various members within the South Asian community, fighting racism in the workplace. So yeah, the BC History Magazine has really reached out to the South Asian community. Hats off to the BC History Magazine for being so progressive. Yeah. You see it?
We're getting little flashes of it.
Hold it
I
up
encourage
in front of your face.
Hold it close to your body, Ellen.
Yeah.
And move back. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
there we go. Whoa.
If you would like to see, if you go to the BC History Magazine website, you can see all of our back issues, and you can get a better view of the one that Elwyn is trying very valiantly to share with us. And I'm just going to take a peek back in the questions. And yes, this might be an Imogene question. I'm going to read it. Mention was made in the presentation of some sort of geographic database of the location and descriptions of the great many Chinatowns throughout the province. I would appreciate a bit more description of this resource, whether it can be accessed by the general public, where it is located, and whether more information continues to be added to this resource. Thank you. Oh, Imogene, if you could unmute.
I just moving
Okay, good.
things
You got
around
it.
the screen. So there's something called the BC geographical names, and I'm just going to copy that and put it into the chat. I think I can do that. So let's see if I can do this right now. Oh no, that's not going to do. Well, maybe I'll do it here. There. So I think I did. I may have not done it correctly. Anyways, I'll give it to Rosalie. She can send it out because I may have copied something else into it. Anyways, So the BC geographic name. So if you have a name, you can plunk it in there and it will give you information. So, and the names that are part of the dictionary, phrase book and dictionary, when you if you look at the online version of it, it shows, so I have a picture and it's full, you can see it. So those are all the names. The other thing we can also give you is a copy, like I'll give you the link for the phrase book and dictionary that's part of the Chung collection. So you can go to the back of it. So what's interesting is it has BC place names and then it says important Canadian names. And then you look at them and think, where is that? It's some small little place that you may have never heard. But again, it was relevant to the Chinese Canadian community. Otherwise, it wouldn't be listed. So when I look at it, I think of my cousin's husband who's since passed away. So when he arrived in Canada, he went out to Rollo, Saskatchewan, and like most people say, well, where is Rollo, Saskatchewan? So you know the television program Corner Grocery, that was filmed in Rollo, Saskatchewan. So that's where he ended up. And one of his stories is like he landed, they put him on the train. When he arrived, he had this thin jacket on, and his uncle or whatever just gave him a bottle of, you know, like hard liquor. He's like, take a swig of this. And then they walked to the restaurant. So it's just, you know, where people ended up is pretty amazing.
Andrew?
Yes, this is a little side project I'm doing as well for my own research to map out places. And a great resource also available online is the 1913 Chinese Business Directory of the World, which you can find online at the Hathi Trust. The original book is in the University of California, Berkeley Library, but it was compiled by a researcher in San Francisco who wrote to he was a Wong, he wrote to all the Wongs that he knew, from Indonesia to Toisan to Panama to Cuba and to British Columbia. And he listed all the businesses he knew in many towns, as well as a Chinese name or transliteration of the name. And this is a great resource. I've kind of created my own little Google map and placed pins for my own research. As well, there is an amazing directory that was done in 1950, based out of New York, called The Chinese in the Americas. And it was done by a member of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, who was kind of going around and talking to community leaders. And he wrote this book that also records many societies and laundries and restaurants across Canada. It's a very hard book to find. There is no digital copy of it, but if you do see a brown volume of the Chinese in the Americas with gold writing on it in your grandpa's box of stuff in your attic, know that it is a very desired and precious resource for researchers, and highly recommend. Both of those resources, by the way, are in English and in Chinese, and are very, very helpful to see what the Chinese name of a business might be if you only know it as the Wing Key Laundry in Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. You can find what the Chinese name was. And we see chain migration play out in those directories as well. For example, in Chicago, there are a lot of Moys. There are not a lot of Moy clanspeople in BC. There was a couple prominent families, but we see that chain migration followed that. A lot of Yis and Mas on the prairies. And so we can see through paper trail as well where surnames ended up, oftentimes because your bachelor uncle wants you to wash dishes in the back of his cafe and in Northern Ontario, and you know that's where you're going to go, because that's where a job is and where family is.
Imogene, I have a follow-up for you. In your article, you posed a couple of questions, and one of them was, what sites might be missing in reference to the maps? Can you speak to what that question means to you?
I think part of that question was based on the Heritage BC cultural map. So I was involved in it. And so a number of sites were suggested. And I think, and you know, I could be mistaken, but I think there was only like 77 or 78 that were selected. So they had a criteria. And I'm thinking, like, because many of these places have been forgotten. So somebody hears that there is this place, they recognize that it's there, but there's nobody in the community that knows the significance of it. So the fact that it existed is meaningful to somebody, but they're not there anymore, right? So my feeling is that probably many of the sites that were attached to a community, and that community could have been, like a dozen plus people. But today we wouldn't think, okay, why should we be noting a place that has a dozen plus people? But the fact that they were a unique community and they were erased, that says something. And I guess the other thing about, and this is about how we perceive Chinatowns. So a number of years ago, okay, let me even backtrack further. When I was a kid, because I was born and raised in Greater Vancouver, I thought, like Vancouver's Chinatown. Well, of course everybody came from Vancouver's Chinatown because there's no other Chinatown, like in my mind, other than Victoria. So again, that misperception. And then as an adult, actually, when I moved to Nanaimo, I remember this fellow coming through, and he was from Alert Bay, and he talked about Alert Bay's Chinatown. I thought, what? What do you mean? Alert Bay's got a Chinatown? I never thought of it as that. And again, it was those half dozen businesses that had, some of them had families, some of them were not families. It was just the one or two guys that ran the laundry or whatever. But they were all clustered at one end of the street. And they referred to themselves as a Chinatown. So again, we have to get out of our heads that it's a people and this is their community. And the community they call Chinatown could be those only dozen people, right? So again, when you're thinking about the Heritage BC cultural map, yeah, I'm quite sure there's a lot of places missed because it's again about our perception.
Thank you, Imogene. Just keeping an eye on time here. And Rosalie, I believe I caught all of the questions. If you could just let me know if there's any that I've missed. I've got a question for everybody. And a few of you have already touched on this, but if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak to this tonight, how were you introduced to your article topic? And did it find you or did you find it?
I could say something, but I'm waiting for it because I think I've spoken a lot.
We love hearing from you, Imogene. If you wouldn't mind talking, Imogene, and sharing what your thoughts are, and then if there's anybody else on the panel that would like to answer that, they can
Okay.
Put up their hand or gesture.
So my article is based on the Chinese and English phrase book and dictionary. I never knew it existed. So my father passed away in 1998, and I wasn't involved in clearing out his belongings. And then I don't know, it's probably over a dozen years after the fact of his passing, my sister gives me, the box. And she said, "Here, you can have this." And it's like, I don't know. I open it and there's this dictionary. And like I said, my initial response was, it's just a dictionary. And then I flip through it and then it's like, like the jaw drops and you realize it's social history from the end of the 19th century. Like, we don't have people talking to us, but we have this dictionary and the phrase book. And as Elwyn indicated, it has English. And so it is a dictionary and phrase book because it's to help those individuals to communicate, right? So they might not know English, but they can read the phonetic of the Hoisan dialect, like the Cantonese dialect from the various villages. And so it's the phonetic of that. So it's written out, and then it has the proper Chinese translation, but then the English. So, if you were somebody that could read Chinese, you could teach yourself English with this. It may not be perfect, but you could teach yourself because it had the phonetic. And it's very specific because it comes from the Guangdong province. So, basically, Sayup County, that is the dialect, right? So it's very, very site specific. So for me as an anthropologist, and I always say I'm not a historian, but as an anthropologist, I'm looking at all these different aspects of the culture, right? So it's not just the written material. It's like, how do you view it from that cultural behavioral aspect? And because it is from that very specific location, it says so much, but it also says so much about what was happening here because the publication was produced on Hastings Streets by the Thompson Stationery. It's like, wow, it's a homegrown artifact. And as far as I'm aware, there's at least two versions. My copy has a 1910 preface. In the Chung collection, there's a 1910 version and a 1913 preface. So the content is identical as far as I can tell. Obviously I haven't flipped through everything, but the preface has the two different dates. But if you look at the frontispiece, it has something about registering with the Canadian government in 1897. So I had a translation done because I don't read Chinese. And based on that, and I do need to get some other things tweaked about it because I think the names that were used are in Mandarin because there's certain ways of how names are presented that, like if you look at Chinese names, they don't use the X. It's something that is used later. So that date there, it seems to be collected in 1893. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on in BC at that time when you think of the legislation that, like there was already a head tax, right? 1885. So the fact that it's in from the 1890s says so much, like what were the jobs that people had? What were the potential conflicts? Because they talk about, law. I haven't looked at it close enough to see whether there's any mention about the chicken oath, but that might be something to check out. So like I said, I think for the Chinese and English phrasebook and dictionary theses, like a student that wants to do like an honors paper or a master's degree, I think this is wide open. So if there's listeners out there that are thinking, yes, this is a source, and then now that we have more documents available to us, there's that layering on to make a much more richer story. So there's a story told in the dictionary itself or the phrasebook portion, but then when you get the human side, the actual newspaper clippings to support that. So that is actually one of my pet projects. Like I need to carve it out. Like I have to say no to other projects to do this project, but I would like to hive off a portion of it to do some of that.
Thank you, Imogene. Elwyn?
Yeah, so just to be clear, so the phrase book that we're all talking about, and I've got the 1913 version. So when you look at the Chinese phonetic sounds. So someone that say speaks Mandarin or is from Guangzhou or Hong Kong, they're gonna look at this and go, that don't make any sense. It's for people like you said, Toisan, Siyip, and because this goes so way back, and what's really fascinating, I find, are some of the occupations that they decide to translate. Some of the occupations include coal mining, that's coal mining, salmon canneries, sawmills, railroad work, clearing the land. That's what my grandfather did. So these are all old occupations related to resource extraction and that type of thing. So this is a fascinating document. So if you're interested in taking a look at this, I know if you go to our friends at the Chinatown Storytelling Center, they have one behind Plexi. Of course, you can also look at this online as well at the UBC site.
So the other thing that Elwin didn't mention is they have a list of vegetables. So I think, again, who were the vegetables for? Clearly they were for Westerners. So it's like they were farming for, not for themselves, they were farming for other people. So that, again, you get that particular time period to know exactly what was going on. You know, like what were people eating? You know, like it's not just the Chinese people, but it's like what were the communities that they were embedded in, that they needed to learn to serve and cook. Yeah.
So I'm just keeping an eye on the time here and wondering if there's any concluding remarks that anyone would like to share in our last couple of minutes. If there's something that's come up for you over the last hour and a half, couple hours. And if we've all made our remarks,
I'll go last.
Elwin's got
Does
some
anybody
good.
else have anything to say? I'd like to just have some closing words. Go ahead.
Oh, I think you have the floor, Elwin.
OK，今晚嘢我哋多謝晒你哋嚟參加我嘅講故事。以前我咧，那老華僑住埋晒那神父公下我咧，那中國人，我今晚嘢呢，我多謝晒那老華僑。I will finish off tonight with the way I usually finish off my tours at the Chinese Canadian Museum. I thank people for coming to making the effort to come into Chinatown to visit us at the Chinese Canadian Museum. And I thank you more for joining us tonight on the tour. There are like a bazillion distractions where you could have gone tonight, including hockey game, but you chose to join us tonight. So by showing up tonight here, you honor your parents, your grandparents, the Low Waqu trailblazers who took it on the chin, and sometimes they even turned the other cheek as well while they were being bullied, made fun of, and humiliated for many decades. So all so that the next generation, us, can live the life of Riley, and some of us can even make a living flapping our lips talking about their stories. So we always must remember that we can never forget their sacrifices, and we stand on their shoulders. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight, and just share the word, tell the stories of your parents, your grandparents. If you don't know what it is, find out about it. 多謝晒今晚嘢，我好真係好心氣。Thank you. Good night.
Yes, thank everyone for joining us tonight for this, and thank you, Aimee, for publishing our various stories and being open to having almost a whole edition dedicated to these stories of our community.
Thank you, Catherine. I have just a couple of remarks myself, and with having Sarah and Elwyn on the BC Historical Federation board, I have been encouraged to ask you all to check out the BCHF website to learn about the upcoming conference in Williams Lake at the beginning of May. The Chinese Canadian Museum is sponsoring a talk at that conference. I'd also like to thank the panelists for a really incredible conversation tonight. I'm not sure how I'm going to fall asleep after with so many thoughts and reflections. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing sharing your views. And thank you, of course, to Rosalie for keeping everything running smoothly and coordinating all of us so that this could run seamlessly. And echo what Elwyn and Catherine have already said, which is appreciate all of you for being here tonight and supporting these important conversations about the past and how the past affects the present. Thank you.
Yeah, we're right at 8:30. Thank you everyone for, being right on time and for all of the wonderful stories that were shared today. Just a last reminder as well, I put the link in the chat, but if you'd like to be entered into a draw to win one of the copies of the BC History magazine that we were just talking about all evening, please fill out the feedback survey by the end of tomorrow. And with that, good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.